first of all, I have to agree with everything Dr. Nevin said, because on one hand, we have been very lucky. It's a very curious thing why we've had the COVID story that we've had. You know, at one point it was, well, Africa was different, sub-Saharan Africa was different. And then you had the kind of the Delta crisis, I would call it, in East Africa over the summer during this past few months, which then made it seem like we weren't so different anymore. And we were actually in West Africa just as vulnerable. Except the numbers, the COVID numbers have been coming down. We don't have quite the same level of hospitalization. And yeah, I mean, I think it's too soon to call it in terms of us being completely out of the woods, but I think that is a really important kind of determining factor, I think, which may actually cause West Africa to overtake East Africa as the growth center this year, because East African countries seem to be very vulnerable in that sense and keep going back and forth in and out of lockdowns in a way that this region hasn't had to suffer. So in terms of a potential headwind, which is it's hard to measure from where we stand, is what COVID looks like going forward in the next few months. Maybe West Africa won't be so lucky anymore, but that's very hard for anybody to tell. And given the low level of vaccination in West Africa, which I think is even tracking lower than East Africa at the moment, I think that kind of puts the region in a very vulnerable spot should you have kind of these outbreaks, because the only, to the extent you have a very serious outbreak, the only kind of response is to shut down parts of the economy, which would have a very sort of negative impact on activity. So that's an immediate one that comes to mind. A more sort of longer, I don't even think this is longer term, unfortunately, I think it's more near term than we appreciate, is this global energy transition that is underway because of the global climate emergency, which I think has gained a bit more momentum this year with the publication of the UN IPCC report in August, which essentially is a code red for humanity and kind of focuses minds on, this is an issue that's maybe difficult to appreciate in Africa, but the region, let me just pause and remind us that even though the African region contributes the least of any other region in the world to emissions, to greenhouse gas emissions, we have 100% of the total impacts of climate change at our door. I mean, if you live in Lagos, you're familiar with the flooding. If you live it's not just the flooding, it's just kind of the change in climates, the kind of the effect on food security, food health, and water security. Those impacts are here, but the net result of that report and kind of this global sense of urgency is the world is moving away from reliance on fossil fuels in a very deliberate and kind of immediate way. And there are many economies in our region that are still very reliant 100% on fossil fuels that don't necessarily have an immediate plan for transition, except the world has moved on already. And I think the near-term risk, and I don't think it's a long-term risk anymore, is that some economies get caught unprepared with stranded assets of fossil fuels, of not so much coal, but oil and natural gas, which, I mean, our view has been at the AFC'S to try and kind of guide a discussion, a global discussion that seeks to not penalize natural gas investments in the same way that oil is now kind of being seen. But that being said, I think even just the fact that a lot of economies, I mean, the biggest economy in our region is very much, it's an oil economy. I think that there's a big question about how investors on one hand, mainly global investors, will shape the course of prospects, of economic prospects for not just for Nigeria, but for some other economies in this region. And I think that's a real it's a real risk, as I see it. I think that's a really important enabler in terms of potential kind of changes on the, I mean, it's not on the horizon, it's here. But maybe I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on how the implementation is going, because it very much relies on how well it's implemented, how the extent to which there is infrastructure and local content, manufactured local content to sort of grease that sort of trade dynamic. So this region, the ECOWAS region, actually already, trades to some extent, but that trade within the region could really be kind of accelerated by the by the agreement. But more importantly, I think you need infrastructure. You need infrastructure to provide that kind of marginal boost. And without it, I don't think that we're going to go very far. And unfortunately, the story of infrastructure investment because of COVID has been impacted. I mean, we were coming off a very long run of sustained increased infrastructure investment. But because of COVID, a lot of governments are now obviously shifting to firefighting and to debt worries, etc. So I think finding the financing, which is why this forum, and I think is really critical, because local currency financing is an extremely important component of that. Organizing the financing, the long-term patient capital that will invest in infrastructure on the continent, in bridging that gap, is going to be critical to how much we can reap from this really important free trade agreement.